and welcome to the second part of our little bunny draw along. What I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to continue blocking in the underpainting across the rest of the bunny, and then we'll start focusing in on some more of that detail. So I'm going to come in and work on this little ear here. Now we've got this little bit of fur just up in the back here. And I'm just going to come in with that 704, that warm grey 3. I'm going to pop that in there. Again, medium sort of pressure. I'm then going to run that down just this front little section here of the ear as well. Just running down that little edge there. Then I'm going to come in with the black. It's the 750 because it is quite dark just on this edge of the ear. And just be careful with your shaping. We want to keep that shape right. And that's really important, especially, well, it's important all the time, but more so when you're not putting in a background. You want to really sort of keep this sort of background area as clean as you possibly can. Now I'm going to come in, I think I'll use the 635, that's the Bister. I'm just going to use that as the base layer. And I'll probably come in and use that, I think, across that whole little center section. And we'll make any adjustments to that using, our lights and our darks. Same down just under here as well. I might not bring it all the way into this center area here, because it is a bit lighter. Make sure we're coming across on our transfer lines there. Now what I usually do for my tutorials, if I am giving out a line art, I'll make where the hair sometimes comes over a little bit into the background, if you've got like little tufts of hair, for example, I will actually make that line art just a tiny little bit smaller so that you can afford to come straight up to that line and still do the little hairs coming over. So that's another thing to always sort of keep in mind if you are sort of doing your own line arts, for example. Now I think I'll bring that 704, that warm grey 3. I'm going to bring that down into here as well. But I am going to add a tiny little bit, I think, of the 681, that light flesh. Just want to sort of add a little bit more of a, it's not as, you can see up in this ear that we did in the first lesson, that we did the more of that sort of caput mortuum sort of colour. You're not really getting that in here, but I am getting a warmer sort of brown colour there. So in addition to that, I might even come in with a little bit of the 182. That was the brown ochre. Again, just to sort of give it that little bit of warmth in there before we give that a blend. I think this little tip on the ear could just be a bit darker, so I'm going to bring a bit of that 635 just up into there as well. And again, I'm just sort of looking at the reference image, seeing the shapes here. I'm just adjusting that little bit of brown. The black of the ear as well. this is quite sort of thin, and it is sort of coming across a little bit just over the top of that lighter section, like so. I'm just going to remove a little bit of that dust. All right, so onto our little bottom part of our body. I'm not going to do in these little shadows underneath until right at the end, but I do want to just block in the body as best as we can. Very out of focus, like we said, really on the body, but we want to get that bottom part of the body in, so then we can start bringing some of these little facial sort of hairs coming out over the top, just to give them that sort of fluffy look. Now when we're doing our underpainting here, same as what we did up here, we've got to be mindful of the tones that are sitting in this white fur. So over on this side, it is quite sort of bright and got a little bit of that bluey tinge to it. So I'm going to use the 110 again. Again, I'm just going to have a look at the reference, and it is quite white, you know, sort of bright, all the way sort of down. There's a little bit of that sort of colour that's coming up off the, I suppose, the sand that he's sort of sitting on. I'm just going to come in, blot in that grey-white. Again, you can come right up to the edge here with your underpainting, and then we will be able to come in and over just with those little sort of wispy hairs right at the end. I'm going to come just back in and over this little section here as well with another little layer of that. Again, it's really bright. What we've got to be very careful of here when we're going, because we use the 110 here as well on the face, we want to make sure we don't lose the shape of that face. So if you look closely at your reference image, you'll actually see that there is another colour, just sort of like what the fur that's closest to the bunny. So I'm going to change that, and I think I'm going to use the 704, the warm grey 3. And I'm going to put the warm grey 3 just underneath, just that little chin area. In fact, it could be a little bit darker. I'm trying to think, maybe I'll try a bit of the 706. Hasn't really changed it that much, a little bit darker, but either would work. I might just come over the top of that with that 706. And then just down, and that's the warm grey 4. And then just underneath the little chin as well, you can just sort of see that it's just because it's cast a little bit in that shadow, you've got that sort of darker tone underneath. So by us sort of plotting that in, it's ensuring that we've got that slightly darker layer, and we're not going to lose where this part of the face, because it potentially, if we just brought this colour right up here, we wouldn't have had a clue where one started and one finished. Again, getting a little bit darker shades just in certain little sections. You can see that sort of shadow in the reference image. In fact, these little bits over here could be even a bit darker, so I might even use the 708 for that. Very light though, I don't want it to go too dark. I'm just adding just a little bit, just where I can see some of those darker sort of areas. It's quite dark This is the shadow that's sort of on the ground, but I am going to sort of just come in with that pencil and just pop that in, just again, so that we sort of know where that division is on those little fluffy feet. And then coming up in this little section here, you can see where the hairs are sort of coming through. I want to be getting that bottom part of that foot darker. It's a lot easier to come in over the top of this with some of our lighter colours than trying to necessarily pull some of that sort of darker grey up and in between. So just add a little bit of that 708, that warm grey 5, just at the bottom. All right, we'll come back in with that 110, that grey white. Just going to fill in just up to that little section there. Again, even in this early stage, we want to kind of have an idea of the direction, especially underneath the body here. You can see where these sort of little hairs are coming down out from underneath that chin area. I'm not going to pull them all the way down into this grey yet until we've done a little bit of that blending. And then on this side, it sort of changes direction again. Again, just be aware of where that sort of change in colour occurs. Like I said, we've got a bit of that brown just on the ends of these little paws there. And over the edge of my line art there as well, which I'm going to need to just fix up a little bit. Just being careful coming up into that ear. Don't want to be pulling too much of that white into that ear area. Lighter just there on that leg. And then I'm going to come in with that 1H2. It's our brown ochre. I'm just going to pop a bit of that just on those little sections of his foot. A little bit of the base layer for there. All right, now we want to blend those, push them down into the paper. So I'm going to start with the ear. You can use Q-tip or you can use your paper stump, whatever your preferred method is. I'm just going to come over the lighter sections first. Again, sort of be mindful of your blending. You still want to be sort of blending in that direction of that fur. A little bit down at the bottom. And then just up into that black. Again, just being careful. And I'm just going to neaten up that little edge with my kneadable eraser. I am going to be pulling some little hairs out there, but I want to be in a little bit more control of what I'm doing. I'm just taking my kneadable eraser, just putting it into like a little point. And then just running that along the edge just to lift off any of that pigment. Same with this little one here. A little bit over, like so. All right, I'm just going to grab a clean Q-tip. I'm going to just come in on this white and just very gently just sort of push that grey-white down and into your paper. Careful getting around that darker sort of sections. You don't want to be pulling that pigment sort of into your whiter area. It's, like I said, some of this we want to be keeping lovely and bright. Again, I'm just turning over my Q-tip and I'm just going to come in and just blend in that 706 that we just popped underneath this little chin area. And then we can sort of do just that little brown sections. And then we can, I don't want to bring that brown into there, so I might just use a new Q-tip. Just bring that little darker section in like so. Again, I'm just going to get rid of some of that excess. I'm not going to worry too much under here because, like I said, I'm going to put a little bit of a shadow in there, just so that our bunny's not looking like he's sort of floating in midair. Softening this little transition just underneath, and that's just running that Q-tip just back and forth like so. All right, so that is our base layers down over our whole bunny. Now, like I said, when we did our live, I wouldn't normally do such a big sort of section. But if you're doing a larger portrait, it would probably be that sort of section, and you sort of see the size of it. So that's why I thought we'd just plot all that in first, because he is such a small little bunny. Now I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave this back area here, because like I said, it is very out of focus, and I'd rather get this section here in place first, so that we can then see what we need to do in regards to our blending and things like that to make that really out of focus in the background there. And then once we've done that, we'll then come down and do his little body. So if you feel that your hand will be resting on some of your drawing, just get yourself a piece of the glassine paper and just lay that over your drawing so that you can just rest your hand down on there. So I'm going to start off with this top here, the one that we were working on. And we're just, like I said, it's still out of focus. There's not a lot of detail, but we just want to add another layer on the top just to brighten that up a little bit. I'm going to come in with the 635, the Bister. I'm just going to start pulling a few of those little hairs, little strokes, just down and into that sort of inner ear area. Now you can sort of see just tiniest little hairs just coming out from the background of that ear, but they're very, very sort of faint and out of focus. So we don't want to be necessarily drawing those with our pencil, especially on such a small drawing. And I'll show you ways that we can sort of point to that without using an actual pencil. But all I'm doing here is just looking at that reference and just where some of those darker little sections are just coming into his ear. We just want to make sure that we're getting those sort of plotted in. Same with this sort of little section here, it's a little bit softer. So I'm just starting to sort of hint at a bit of fur structure. We can't really see the fur, it's very, like I said, out of focus. But if you just sort of move your pencil just back and forth in that fur direction that you can see, it'll give that nod to what's actually there that we can't really sort of, really sort of hone in on. I'm going to add a tiny little bit of that 635 just in that shadow in here. I might darken that down still a little bit. And then I'm going to come in. I'm going to use, I think, the dark sepia. No, not the dark sepia, the Payne's grey. I always get those two mixed up. So yeah, the 181 is the one with the more grey tone. And just adding a little bit of that just on that section of the ear I can see is more grey. You don't need a lot of pressure. Again, tiniest little bit. I'm just sort of skimming the surface of the paper here. I don't want to be getting too much pigment down. It's a lot darker. Again, just on the inside little part of that ear. So I'm just coming down here with a bit more of that Payne's grey, just to darken that down a little bit. In this little section here, we need to just add a little bit more of that pigment. Any sort of other little sections that you just think could be a little bit darker. And then we've got just these little lines just coming in to that section of the fur. So we just sort of draw those in, and then when we come in with our lighter colour there, we'll be able to pull that across that darker colour. Now I'm going to use the 175 now, which is the dark sepia. And just in this little fur section, again, we're just getting those little darker little spots. Again, just little back and forth motions. We don't want to be covering that whole area because we just want it to be on that little section. Just where those darker little hairs are sort of peeking through. So just little tufts. You want to be able to see that lighter colour coming through. And then I might just come in and along with that pencil as well, just little dabs just along that back section, just where that face comes over. I don't want to add too much of this in here because, like I said, it's got more of a browny tone, but I think a little glaze, just enough to give it a little bit more depth, like so. All right, now I think actually this little section up here could be darker. I'm going to come in with that dark sepia just on that tip of the ear and just darken that down. All right, now I'm going to come in with the 270, which is our warm grey one. And I'm going to use it just to pull few of these little hairs. Just softening this edge that's coming out into his ear. Just little strokes. We don't want a lot of hairs because, like I said, you know the hairs are there, but you can't really see them because of that out of focus. So just be careful that you are keeping that soft. If you're worried that you've gone a little bit too prominent, I suppose the word is, so that you can really see them, just take your blender or your cotton bud and give it a little tap. And that's enough sometimes just to soften it a little bit and just give you that sort of little blurry sort of look. Now I'm going to continue with that 270, and I just want to just brighten up the sort of edge of the ear closest to the outside here, because as it comes into the ear it does go a little bit more of that cooler tone. Again, I'm just working down the side of the ear and just being careful, having a look at that reference, and a little bit of that colour down into this corner as well, because as you can see that ear does sort of just come down and curls round just into that corner edge there. I think this little section here needs to just be a little bit darker as it comes down, so I'm going to use the Payne's Grey again, just a little dab, just to get the shape of that sort of ear. And then we've got a lighter section here, but it's going on more of that cooler tone, so I'll leave that for another pencil. But up here we're also getting just that little lighter section of fur. So again, we want to be sort of going in the direction of the fur. It is hard to see, but it does sort of come up into that brown and just over that little line, that little edge there of the ear. Because at the moment, that line on my ear is quite thick and prominent there. So by just sort of coming in and just adding just a few little fur strokes, we've got the same here. Again, we can't really see the fur, so we're just sort of dabbing some of that pigment on there. I'm going to pull a few just in here, but I will go over these because, like I said, it is more of that cooler grey coming off the face. And then this little edge here just needs to be a bit more rounded. Like I said, it's quite thin, that little section of the ear. And then in this section here, it needs to be lighter. So I'm just going to keep with that 270. And I'm just going to add a bit of that pigment in there. Again, just having a look at how far those little hairs come out. Tab as well with your finger is sometimes enough to just soften it as well. There's a real sort of distinct little shape in his ear there. I don't want to come in too dark with like the Payne's Grey, but I might just bring the 708. That's our warm grey 5. And I'm just going to try and just sort of adjust that shape slightly. Give that a little soften. Yeah, I think that's a bit better. I'm happier with that. Now again, if you ever feel that you've just, you want it to be a little bit more sort of out of focus, just dab your Q-tip just over the top. And it's enough just to take away any of that sort of little sort of stop-start sort of edges. This just sort of softens it all a little bit more. Same even in here, I might just sort of soften that transition. Now I think the only other thing I really want to do for that little ear is just bring in a little bit more of that bluey sort of grey. And I think for that I'm going to use the 720, which is our cold grey one. Now I'm not going to use a lot, I'm just going to sort of just come down from that warmer grey and just sort of gently sort of pull that just into that inner ear. Nice and gentle. And then we've got this lighter section that I mentioned just down here. I'm just going to pop that in. And then while I've got that pencil, this little area here behind on the little bunny's back, I think needs to be a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to add a bit of that in while I've got that pencil in my hand. Again, it's very out of focus, this little section, but you still want to be sort of getting those lights and those darks sort of in there. Just on the edge here. Just be careful that you don't sort of lose the actual shape of your, your little bunny. It is easy sometimes to just add a little bit more pigment and pull it out further and further, and then you end up that you've sort of distorted the actual look. I'm going to try a little bit of this up here, see if that's going to be bright enough. It might be. I'm just going to add a little bit of that 720 just on that little section coming up his ear. Just to brighten that up a little bit. Again, we can always just a couple of little hairs here and there if you think it needs it. Anything needs to be a little bit brighter. I'm actually thinking I might even come in with a little bit of the Carbothello white. And I'm just going to glaze that just in that lighter section. Just in a couple of spots. And then I am going to just take my blender though and just soften that. I don't want anything within this ear looking sort of too harsh. I want to keep it nice and soft, especially as it sort of comes in from the edge of that ear. Just gently pulling some of that pigment just in to that lighter section, just keeping it nice and soft. Same over here, just giving that a little dab. It just looks a little bit harsh. Right, so I'm going to come in across now, and I might do these other ear. And the reason I'm going to do the other ear first is that I want to be pulling some of this face hairs up and over, which I won't be able to do if this little ear's not done. So we'll start working on that one. But just before I move on to that ear though, I do want to just mention, when I was speaking about just pulling out these little hairs, what the options you've got. Now, these things are called colour shapers. And you can get them on Amazon and at craft stores and things like that. And they get all different sizes. These are the first ones I bought. These are a size 6 or something. And I didn't really use these a lot because they were too big, too clumpy, and I thought a paper stump or a cotton bud would work just the same. But then I decided to give it a try and get the smaller sizes. So this is the size 2, so you can see that properly. That's the size 2, and that's the size 0. Now the size 0 I've been using a lot. You get different sort of shapes and size, sort of, little edges on them. That one's got a funny little shape there, and that one's more of a little flat sort of point. So they come in like a pack of 4 or 5, I think. But this little one here with the really sharp little point, I love just for either really intricate blending, like if you needed to get in and just sort of blend a little reflection in the eye, for example. But what it's also really good for is pulling out these sort of little hairs. And I'll see if I've got enough pastel on that little edges. But if you can see that, if you just dab, I'm hoping the camera is picking that up. You just sort of dab it and just pull it out into the background. And it just creates the softest sort of little fluffy edge. Because there's sometimes you just don't want to be pulling out a pencil stroke, that it'll just be too hard. Now what you can do if you don't have one of these is you can also do the same sort of thing with the Q-tip. And I definitely recommend getting the pointier sort of ones rather than the round Q-tip. And you can do a very similar thing. You can just very gently just brush out from that edge. The Q-tip doesn't quite give you as good a finish as these little colour shapers, but it still does a pretty good job. And the same with just up here, just with the Q-tip. You just very gently just soften that edge and just sort of just pull, a little bit of that pastel out. And it just gives you that fluffy, and I'm hoping you can see that, just that fluffy sort of edge, so you haven't got just a dead straight line. And then if you felt that you had sort of picked up a bit of the pastel and it was looking a little bit, sort of patchy along that line again, all you really need to do then is just come in, with your pastel pencil. I'm just going to come in with, say, the 635, for example. And then you can just ever so gently just come back into there and just sort of fill up any little sort of sections that might look just a little bit sparse after you've pulled out those little hairs. So that's just hopefully a little tip just for getting those fine soft sort of lines. And we'll do the same when we come down on this sort of side of the bunny. You can just very, very faintly see how soft and fluffy he is on the side. So I'll get on with this ear now. All right, so we want to come in with a lighter colour in there. I might even use a little bit of that 110 again, that grey white. And what I want to do is I'm just going to come over this back little section of the ear, just on that sort of lighter grey that we popped in. So same sort of thing. It's quite out of focus, so I'm not stressing too much about really fine detail, not worrying if the pencil is overly sharp, and just little sort of brush, little sort of, little fur strokes, just moving your pencil in the direction of that fur. I'm going to come up into this back area purely just because it is all sort of one section. Again, really blurry up the back here, so I'm just going back and forth with that pencil just to get another layer of pastel down onto there. I can then have a look here and see where I might need to just bring in a little bit more just on this top little edge. Again, be careful if you're coming into that brown, that you just give that pencil just a little bit of a wipe on your paper towel. This one here, we need to add probably a little bit of the 1H2, the brown ochre, and just pull in a few strokes just on that little section coming down the side of his sort of second eye. Again, having a look at that reference, seeing where those little fur directions are going. I'm then going to come in at the back of that with the 270. That's the warm grey one. I'm just going to come down into this little section here between the eye and the ear. Again, just little sort of strokes in that sort of direction of the fur. You can always give that a little soften. As I said, you can always just dab your cotton bud, soften sort of any little sort of bits of pastel pigment that are just sort of sitting on the surface. Can sometimes look just a tiny bit grainy. And then I'm just having a look at this little ear while I've got this 270 in my hand. This little bit here in the ear does sort of come, a few of that hairs comes through into the ear here. Again, I'm keeping that piece of kitchen roll just handy. And then as I pull that pencil just through this little area, I can just give that a little wipe. And then again, we've got a little bit just down here that needs to be a bit lighter, just where that black is sort of coming up into the ear there. I'm going to do the same with this little edge here. Again, I'm just going to start bringing down a few of these little sort of strokes of fur. Again, this is still our early layers. We want to be looking a little bit more at the length of some of these hairs as they come down onto the ear. Once it gets into the center of the ear, you're getting more into that sort of out of focus sort of zone. But we can see a bit more detail up here, so you just want to be aware. You can see I'm not using too sharp a pencil at this point, because this is me just sort of building up that second sort of layer of fur. I don't want to go too bright in here. I think for now, I might just add the tiniest little bit of that colour just coming into this lighter section on the face. You can see that on the reference image, that just before those little tufts of hair come out where the ear is, there is a slightly darker area of that fur. And we might need to darken that down even more when we come on to that little section of the face. I'm going to go in now with the 635, the Bister, and we want to start darkening down this little section of the ear. Just right in here is quite dark. Might need to go, yeah, I'll need to go darker. I thought if I'd blended that a bit, that might show up a little bit better. I might use the 175. So that dark sepia. Yeah, that's better. I'm just running that just up the edge of that ear. And again, I think even the black might be the way to go. I'm just being careful here because this is where sort of part of the little face is coming across. I don't want to come in too dark onto this sort of area here. Just pulling a few of those darker hairs out. Like I said, I think we may need to go down the road of a bit of black there, I think. Again, just on this little section of the ear here is quite dark. So just a few little strokes. Even sort of just in the back of this ear. I might go back in with that 635, the bistre here. You can see there's just a couple of little sections just behind that lighter part of the ear. I'm just going to just pop them in there. And then we can bring those lighter hairs out and over the top. While I've got that pencil, I'm going to darken down just inside this ear. So the same sort of idea as we did up here. We just want to be pulling through some of these darker hairs. And this is where we just want to be careful of the shape of this sort of little band coming down his ear. I don't want that to be too thick. I'm just having a look at the reference, seeing where these darker areas are. And this sort of band that just sort of comes in the middle here. And then I'm going to swap over to my black. And I'm actually going to add a bit of black just in over the top. Just where it's the darkest. Same coming in and down. You can see in that reference image just how dark some of the little sections are on this ear. So we want to be making sure we're getting those dark enough. I don't want to pull that too far into this little tip of the ear though, because if you can see that, you can see it's not nearly as dark as that black edge over here. I'm just coming in with my Q-tip here. And I'm just going to pull a little bit of that darker pigment up into that lighter section there. And if you do follow along with some of my, some of my other tutorials or future tutorials, you'll get to know how much I actually enjoy using a Q-tip to add detail after I've been in a darker section. So say for example, I'm just doing that darker section of the ear. I have pigment on the tip of my Q-tip. I don't want to chuck that away if I can use it somewhere else. So I'm just trying to see if there's a spot that I could use it. I might use it just up here just to demonstrate. So you can take that pigment and you can just add a little bit, for example, into other sections of your drawing. Maybe there's an area that you've got a bit of black pigment on your Q-tip, for example, and you just wanted to just darken down something, but without adding in more pastel. And it just adds so much softness. Like in here, I can just do that fuzzy sort of out of focus look without having to put a pencil to paper. I'm just using some of that pigment that I've got left. And you can always sort of bring it through and into a colour just here and there. And it's a wonderful way, like I said, of just depositing some of that pigment down without having to worry too much about going too heavy-handed. And the good thing is, even if you put something down and you go, oh no, that's a bit, a bit dark, or I'm not happy with that, then you can come across over the top with your pastels. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, I do use that sort of little technique quite a lot. All right, I want to get this black sort of little shape here at the end right. Again, I'm just going to come in with that 750. I want to be getting the little dark areas on this ear as dark as we can. I'm going to darken down just this top little section just a little bit, because I want to get, like I say, I want to make sure that I'm getting the shape of this ear right. I think underneath here could afford to be a little bit darker. I'm just running that black just down into this little shadow area, just to tone this down a little bit. I'm not applying a lot of pressure here. Now as we come up onto this little section here, again, we just want to be having a look and seeing where we think that direction of the hair is going. And the reason we'll know that is by these little hairs coming out. So we know the hairs are going sort of that way. But we'll use that colour shaper or the Q-tip just to pull those little ones out. But I'm just sort of dabbing along this inner line just to soften it, because I don't want this to be a harsh line. I do want that little sort of tip of the ear to be nice and dark though. And we can always come back in with our charcoal pencil, or, if we've got the Creta colour, we can use that at the end. Pull just a couple of little darker ones just through this lighter section. I might revert back to that Bister, I think the 635, just to sort of make sure that we're not going too bright. Just little dabs. Like I say, we don't have a lot of space, so we want to just try and get as much detail in there as we can. So all I'm doing with that Bister is just coming along. Like I said, I just want to break up some of these little edges. Last thing you want is to have dead straight lines. Nature just isn't that uniformed. It isn't that sort of structured. It's soft. So we want to keep that softness. Again, I'm just coming through a little bit of this little lighter area here. Making sure we're getting that structure in there of that ear. Again, you can just dab your pencil. It's a bit like the glazing. Just dab the pencil and just ever so gently just deposit some of that pigment. And you can use your pencils to blend on the paper. You don't always have to come in with a paper stamper or things like that. You can actually just come in with your pencil and just bring it up to that layer that you had in there before, and just soften it and blend it together. I mean, there's lots of different techniques in that you can learn, and you find your own style. It won't take you long to sort of figure out what you enjoy. I'm going to come in with that that vista just up the top here. Just going to come in and add a few little darker hairs. And then I might come in with my black. And I'm just going to sort of redefine where that little eye is. It sort of comes in a tiny little bit there. It's just a few little darker hairs coming down this edge. Definitely darker on the other side of that little lighter little band of hair up the side of his face. This still needs to be a lot darker. I think I will come in. I'm going to come in with a black to start with. If you haven't already had a chance, check out my other free tutorial with the rabbit eye using just 4 pastel pencils, and it talks a lot about tonal value. And tonal value is so important because if you sit back, it's what brings your artwork to life, basically. So if you have a little step back from your drawing and you have a look and you think, okay, what's the darkest areas on the drawing? You find those and then you gauge everything else off of that. And the same works with your lightest areas. You know, usually the reflection in the eye might be your lightest white. Not so much so with this bunny because he does have a lot of white up the side here. And a little bit in his nose. But that's how you sort of gauge your tonal scale. So whenever you hear anyone mentioning tonal values, that's basically, you know, what we're talking about. All I'm doing here again is I'm playing around with this little edge on this little bit of fur that's coming down. I'm going to need to add a little bit lighter pigment on there just to pick up that shape. Need a little bit more of that warm colour. I'm going to come in with that 182 again, that brown ochre. And I'm just going to come in and add a little bit just into this first little section of this ear. And the same just on the edge here. I can see it's just got that warmer tone. Again, a few more little strokes just on this little section here. Might add a tiny little bit just to the tip of this little ear. And then I'm also going to come in here because, like I said, it does have that warmer glow, and I'm just sort of glazing here in that sort of downward direction that I can see in the reference image. Again, just adding a little bit of that warmth. And then I'm going to come in with a much lighter pencil. I might try a little bit of the ivory to start with. And I just want to lighten up a few little sections, a few little hairs. Now again, remember, less is more. So don't be trying to put in, you know, huge big fur strokes that you can't really see in your image. And this is something I'm also quite guilty of, is that I'll zoom in on my iPad, because I have my iPad just basically there. And I'll zoom in on that and I'll be trying to get that amount of detail into a tiny little drawing. And it just, it doesn't work. If you ever find that you do struggle with that, another tip I have for you is actually print off your reference image. Print that off in the size of the drawing you're doing, and have that just sort of sitting just at the side here next to your drawing. And what that does is it limits you to just looking at that drawing. You're not sort of tempted to actually blow it up and try and get too much detail in there. Now all I've sort of done here with that ivory is just added in some of these lighter sort of tones on the end here. Again, I'm not trying to get too much of my detail in there, but I do want to try and get the shape of this ear looking good. Again, we can just glaze a little bit, a little dab with the finger. This here needs to be a lot lighter. So I'm just going to come in with that ivory. Again, just little dots, because we just don't have the space really for big, big sort of first strokes. So tiny little dabs on the paper, just in and around where we need to lighten some of these little sections up. Pull a little bit over so that it's got that fluffy sort of appearance. This will look a bit different once we've actually got some of these white hairs coming out over the top. I'm just going to come back, and I think with the 708, that's your warm grey 5. And just on this little section here of the ear, again, we just want to be making sure, just coming in and around, and on this little section here, making sure that that's dark enough just to reflect where, this little side section here of the eye is, and where that sort of comes out onto the ear, if you know what I mean. Just so we're getting the shape of that ear right, and it's not just looking like it's stuck onto the back. Again, just little dabs. And then even just with that little bit there, you're now getting the idea that this is where the ear is sort of coming out of the bunny, as opposed to it sticking onto this sort of section of his back. Again, just having a look where I think it just needs to have a little bit of that grayer tone. Might even just add a little, tiny little bit of that grey. Like I said, just in and over that lighter section. So just a glaze. You can see I'm just holding the, if I held it any looser in my hand, I could potentially drop the pencil. So that's how light you're wanting to hold it. And then because I want this out of focus, I'm just going to do what I did before with the Q-tip and just sort of push in that direction. And you can see how that's just toned that down a little bit. Because I want to try and get, if I can, this little section just here a bit closer to where I want it to be, because I want to be bringing, these little hairs in a minute out and over the top. I probably could do being a little bit lighter. So I might just add a little bit of that 110, that grey white, just in the center there. You can sort of see that in the reference image, just where it sort of is a bit brighter. Again, I'm going to make sure I've got a clean end on my Q-tip. Just a little dab. And the same just over on this little bit coming into the ear. I'm just going to add a tiny little bit of that grey white, just to brighten that up a little bit. Again, just always have a little sit back in your seat, or if you're standing, just take a little step back and just have a look and see what sort of little adjustments that you could make. You know, does something need to be a little bit lighter, or just give that a little press down there. I think I've made that just a little bit too bright. I think just finally I'm just going to darken down this little section here just a tiny bit more. I'm just coming in with that black and I'm just dotting a bit of that pigment just on some of these little sections that I want it to be a bit darker. Now in this little section here, we've got just a couple of those little eyelashes just coming out and over this section here. So I'm just going to make sure that my pencil is as sharp as I can get it. I'm just going to use the sandpaper for that. You just have a bit of a look. Like I said, we know that this is the little eye. So I'm just going to with the tip of that pencil, I'm just going to create a little bit of that sort of fluffiness. Then I'm just going to take my pencil and I'm just going to draw in those two little eyelashes. It's not much, but like I say, it's these little sort of things that you add in to these small portraits that just make all the difference. Now I'm just going to do the same, very light-handed here because I'm using the black. But I'm just going to pull a little bit of that black just in the bottom edge here of that sort of grayer section. Because it is quite dark. If we have a look at this ear on this section here, it is quite dark down in here. So we want to make sure that we're getting that depth of colour on that side of the face. Again, we can always just back in and around if we feel we need to. Walk over to that 6. Actually, I might use the 175 rather than coming in with the black. A little sharpen. Just want to pull just down from this top part of the ear. I just want to make sure I'm pulling a few of those darker little hairs just into that lighter section. Again, we can just darken down maybe a little bit of the tip here. And again, this will depend as well on, you know, where you're up to with your drawing. You might not need to do this, for example. If you think that yours looks good, that your colour's good, then yeah, by all means, just leave it as it is. I think the only thing I'm going to do is just add a little bit more of that 681, that light flesh. And again, I'm just glazing it. Just want this little section of the ear just to be a little bit lighter. I think that's better. Again, we can just have a bit of a look here. Might just pull out just a few little soft hairs. Break up this little edge here a little bit. Again, just careful pulling into that black. That we just wipe off that pencil. just in here, tiny bit. But like I said, you might not need to actually do this. This again will depend on your drawing. So just make any little tweaks that you think you might need. And again, if you feel you've just gone that little bit too obvious with those strokes, just a little dab. And soften that up. All right, I'm going to come in and work on his face. Now it is quite bright, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in, first of all, with the Arbithello white. I'm just going to start building up just some more of these sort of hair strokes. Now, like I said, we don't have a lot of focus in here. I just want to sort of get an idea on where I am assuming that this hair is traveling. So we know that on the top of the forehead it's going to be coming up, and we know that it sort of sweeps down here. We can see that. So just come over with a few strokes with that white. So just the 100. Don't completely cover that base layer we popped in, because we want to be seeing some of that colour coming through. Now we are going to have to go across some of these darker colours. So again, please be mindful. Get your little bit of tissue or your kitchen roll. I'm just coming in and through some of this more grey section. I think I've got it a little bit too dark. Just pull out a few little whiter hairs if you think you need it. This little section here, I'm just lightening up a little bit in front of the ear. Again, and I want to keep that edge soft, so I'm just flicking out with that pencil, just the tiniest little bit, so that it does come across and into that little ear section. Again, we've got a lighter little hairs just coming up and into that background that you can't really see. You just want to give a little sort of nod to those, so that your little bunny isn't looking just like it's got a dead straight line. And I'm just flicking at a few at the edge there. I'm going to come in with a slightly darker one. I'm going to use the 708. Like I said, we do just have a few little, and make sure that one's sharp as well. Sharp, that's nice, I think. Just where, again, we can just sort of see some of those darker little hairs. Just coming into where that white area is. You can see a few of them just coming down on this little section here. One maybe just on the side of the face. Now look, whatever you do, and I know this is sort of hard to, to sort of comprehend, but don't strive for things to be perfect. I always say, unless someone's looking at your drawing and you have got the original reference image right next to you, no one is going to have the foggiest idea, what it should or shouldn't look like. I'm just flicking a few of those darker hairs just into that lighter section now, before I come in with that white pencil down the front here, just where you can see that darker hairs. So if you're doing like commission portraits and things like that, then that's a little bit different, because people know basically what their animal sort of looks like. But if you're just sort of drawing for yourself, or drawing, just for, doing a competition or any of those sorts of things, or to display in a gallery, whatever you're doing this for, no one is going to go, oh my God, I don't think that hair was supposed to be there, or that little bit of fur there looks in the wrong spot. Nobody is going to care. So if I can give you one word of advice starting out, is just take the pressure off yourself. It really isn't the be all and end all to get everything absolutely perfect. But I suppose it does sort of, it is hard, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, I must admit, and I sort of really doubt myself sometimes. But, try not to do what I do. Don't stress. Keep it light-hearted. We're here to enjoy our drawings. And look, who cares if it's not perfect? Every drawing is a step forward. Everything you do is bringing you closer, to refining your skills and learning things. I'm just coming around. Remember, wipe off that pencil. Having a look again at the sort of direction that hairs are coming out. There's not much detail in there. You can always just come back and forth with that pencil. I think I have. I don't know if you can see it in the painting, in the drawing, but just in here, I've picked up a bit of that pesky brown. And of course, I've just muddied my white a little bit. Hopefully I'll be able to just sort of fix that up a little bit. But again, that's why I'm too busy chatting, that's the problem. I think that's why it's, like I said, it's so important to just get into that habit of just, wiping that pencil off. Getting just a few more details. It's going to lighten up, just coming up into that side of the face. Again, I just want to get that nice sort of transition. I don't want this rough sort of line coming down onto his cheek. Again, this is just where it's important just to have a look at that reference. Yeah, I might just leave that white little section there for the time being. I do want to pull out these final little hairs, but I want to come in and just do his nose, because that'll just finish off that part of his face. I'm going to use the ivory. I'm thinking whether I don't really want to make it more red. I might just use a bit of the 635 as well. So for the 635, that bistre, I'm just going to come in and just on the nose. We might need to darken this down a little bit more. In fact, I think we will have to. But I want to just see the shape of that nose in the middle. And you've got that darker little section of hairs. I've actually gone over the top of my light section there as well. I'm having a bit of a shocker. And then same coming out from that lighter section there of the nose. We can just sort of see where those darker little hairs are coming out. Softening this other edge here as well. Like I said, I don't want that just to be a solid line. And then I'm going to come in with the ivory. And I'm just, again, we've got very little room here. So I'm just going to pull a few of these little hairs are coming up the side of the little nostril. This little side here is a lot brighter. Just want to make sure that we're getting that lighter section in there. It could probably even get just a tiny little bit of the white just on the very sort of tip of that nose. And then I'm just going to come in again with that ivory. And it's because it's such a small area, it's basically just little dots. Don't even try and do spur strokes. Just take your pencil, look at your reference, because it's still important to get that darker areas right. So you can see along this side here is a bit brighter. So you just add a few more dots. Up in the center here is darker, so you don't need as many dots. So space them out a bit. Don't put so much pressure there. We still want to get the shape of our little nose right. He does have that little darker section that comes down onto the nose. So I might even use the 175 for that one, the dark sepia. Again, just dots. Bring that dark down. I'm going to lighten up the other side of it. Again with that ivory. Again, little dots. We start putting big sort of strokes in here. You know, you can see a bit more of definition here on the nose, but here and on the side of the face here, the little hairs are really, really short. I'm just coming in with that dark sepia, and again, I'm darkening down some of this top section of the nose. And then I'm also going to come in and just put a few of that dark sepia dots just in the center of that nose as well. A few little lines just coming up from the middle. But again, a little dot will do just the same. There's a couple of little dots just underneath that nose. Pop them in there. Going a little bit darker there. I might have just sort of caught the paper. Gently dab over that with a bit of white. Now normally I wouldn't do that because that is going to change the colour there. But because of round the nose anyway is quite light, we'll probably get away with that. Use my black. Just on the edge of this little little section here of the nose. Just got that darker line. The little hairs just coming out. Again with that ivory. And I'm just going to come around this little lighter section underneath here. Again, just little dots. We are not going to get our strokes into such a small area. I'm going to use the 1H2 brown ochre, and I'm going to use it just to warm up again, just this little section just round the nose. Same over this side, needs to be a tiny bit lighter before we come in with a bit of that ivory. And just again with that ivory, just a few little dots. I'm going to move this glassine because it keeps sticking to my hand. It's sort of scrunching in the background. It needs to be a little bit lighter, I think. Again, just add a few more little dots. We've got some lighter little hairs in here. Again, don't want this to be too light though. Again, have a look at your reference and see where those darker areas are. And just a little bit of that warmer tone. I'm going to just come in with a little bit of that 182. I mean, don't either sort of be bound by the pencils that I've mentioned. I mean, I had to sort of come up with a list that I thought I would use. This is just me back in with the ivory. Because obviously with it doing a live drawing, we needed to sort of know what pencils we were going to use. But if I was doing just a recorded tutorial normally, I would probably pull a few different colors out from my initial choices. And then obviously by the time that you guys get it, it would be a slightly different list. I didn't want to do that in this instance because, especially if you've gone out and got specific pencils, I didn't want to change it. So there is a few sort of areas on this bunny that we could have chosen a different pencil. For some of these sort of areas coming up the nose, might have gone with maybe a yellow ochre, perhaps. And I'm second guessing myself now, hoping that yellow ochre's not on my material list. If it is, use yellow ochre. But it just goes to show that the colour isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. I mean, you could do this bunny, a pink bunny if you wanted to. The trick is getting those tonal values. Now, all I'm doing here with this pencil is I'm just coming in and across that little line and just softening it with a little bit of that ivory. Again, so that I've got that nicer transition sort of going into that white. So it's not just a stark line around the face of the bunny. And same here, I'm just breaking that up a little bit so that before we sort of bring these whiter hairs around, that little edge there is softer. Now, just on this section here of the bunny, we want to be a little bit more careful because we want to sort of try and maintain those sort of darker lines that are coming out from the center of that face. So when you're putting in your little marks there, just be aware that we still want to keep that sort of shape. And if you have sort of lost it a bit, then, you know, just come in. I might use a little bit of the dark sepia. And again, you can just come in with a few of those little dots and just redefine some of that shape. It's basically just those little, sort of where the little hair follicles come out from the nose with these long whiskers, which we'll draw at the end. Again, just a few little marks. Just have a look. See if there's a couple of little dark dots there that we could put in. I don't think I'm going to try and get too much more detail into the side of that face. Maybe a couple of little darker little dots here and there perhaps. I mean, it probably could be lighter. I might even try a little bit of the white, just on a couple of little sections. I'm going to make sure that this is sharp though, because I really want to just put a few sort of little lighter dots. Again, I just want to sort of dab that pencil just on some of these little sections, just where it's sort of, you can see the lighter little hairs. Don't want to go overboard though. And like I say, if you have got that yellow ochre, and I didn't completely sort of ruin that on my material list, yeah, maybe add a little bit of a yellower tone into there. All right. Now this little mouth section of our bunny, we'll need to add a little bit of that 642, that Caput Mortuum Violet Light. And I'm just going to gently dab a little bit of that just on that side of the mouth. Can't really see it on this side. We can also see just the tiniest little bit just where the actual mouth is. I'll put a little dot of that there as well. It's not much. And then just in with the black. Just want to put a few little, like I said, I've just got a few little dots along that line, just to break it up from being a really stark sort of, you know, just a drawn line on your drawing. Bring some of those darker little spots just out. I'm just going to darken down just under the mouth here as well. And it's just, you're just going to be very sort of delicate with it, because like I say, it is a very small little spot. I'm going to come in with the white. Again, I'm just doing exactly the same thing. I'm just sort of, again, just sort of muting that down. Just looks a little bit too stark. Lost the sort of little shape of this nose too, I think. Let me grab my ivory. I'm just going to come down onto that black a little bit more. Just change that shape a little bit. I think that looks a little bit better. That ivory could probably come up a little bit there. Again, just a little bit of the white. Just on the tip of the nose. Okay, so just underneath the little chin here, we've just got that little hairs coming out. Again, just having a look at that direction. We want to be leaving a little bit of that gap, just where we've got that darker pigment in there. You can't really see too much on this side because all of these lovely long whiskers are coming down. It does go a little bit darker here. I'm going to grab my Q-tip and I'm going to blend a little bit that little edge just to darken those down a bit. And I'm going to come back in at the top here and just add a few little hairs coming over the top. Again, these are more the whiskers, so I don't want to be popping them in too early. We've got this little section just under the ear. It's quite bright. Again, we've got that sort of little gap there. We just want to keep that in mind when we're popping in this fur. I'm going to come back up in here. And keeping that nice and loose, nice and fuzzy. Need to come up to the face. So again, we're just having a good look here. One thing you've got to be aware of when you're drawing as well is have a look at your reference. See where the hairs are. So for example, the hairs all around the face that are coming out over the top. You want to be drawing these ones on the back first, because otherwise it's so hard to get those in between. So you've got to kind of just imagine if those hairs weren't there, you know, what would it look like underneath? And this is where I'm just going to keep that kitchen roll handy here because I'm going into that dark. You just want to come in and just pull some of those hairs in and over that darker section. Again, just being mindful. Wipe off that pencil. And just over on this section. Again, don't want to be coming too far up. We do want that sort of little band of that darker hair. So this sort of little foot is quite bright. Be careful bringing up any of this sort of yellowy color here, because that will really muddy our colors. Like I said, it's out of focus, a lot of this fur. I'm just sort of softening it up and into that darker shadow. And bringing that down this side here as well. Careful there, but that brown sort of coming up on my pencil. Again, I'm just going to ever so gently in the direction of that fur. Very careful coming into those darker areas of that sort of areas of brown. Same on this side. Nice little soften just up into that transition. And just soften those little chin hairs there. Alright, just gentle on these little ones here, because I don't want to be pulling them back up into the white. Add a little bit more white. I think we've left a little bit too much of that darker hair showing. And then again, you can just give that a little soften. Now this little section in here is quite dark. Might even come in with a black there. Very gently though. And just sort of get that little shadow in under that leg. Same on here. Getting to that stage now that we want to make sure that we're getting, you know, these darker little areas dark enough. Again, you can just come in with your Q-tip, just give that a little soften. Again, if we pick up a little bit of that pigment, you can always use it just to soften any sort of edges underneath in that shadow. Do need to brighten up these little sections on the feet as well. I'm going to come in with the ivory. And just add, like I said, you can't really see what's going on here. So just a little bit of that, and then a little bit of a blend, bit of a soften. Soften this little section here as well. If I can just pull down a little bit of that white. I don't want that to be too too dark. Just a little bit too dark there for me. Again, we can just come in with that white. And just add a bit more of that pigment. That's just little tips of his back sort of legs. Again, if you think you need to add just a little bit more of the white, you can just come in and around. Because I'm not too stressed about getting sort of strokes of fur here, I'm just sort of coming in just with the more of the side of my pencil. I've lost his little chin, so I'm just going to come in and just redefine a little bit of that chin under there. And here, this is really quite bright. Here too. If you take a little step back from your drawing sometimes, you see where you've just got that really stark looking line, and I can see one just right there. That is not what the reference image looks like. So I'm just going to come in and over that join and just add a little bit more of that pigment, and that's just sort of got rid of that sort of nasty looking line that was just sort of sitting there. Now I am going to come in and use some of that General's, the white chalk pencil, because I definitely want to brighten up some of these little bits of fur. I'm going to wait until I've got a bit of the shadow in here as well before I pull too many of these little hairs out. Making sure I've got a clean Q-tip. That soften. I'm just going to have a look at this little back area here and just give it a final little tweak now that we've got the face sort of almost done. I think I'll just use the 635, and that's the bistre. Just again, very light pressure using the side of the pencil. I'm just going to just come in and just give a little bit of a nod to the fact that that is fur as well in the background. I'm hardly touching the paper. Softening some of these little edges. I'm just going along there and just seeing where some of that darker little sections are. Just little bits. I'm still thinking this little section here needs to be a little bit darker. I'm just adding a little bit of the 708. Just come in a little bit of the 270. No, it's a cooler one, that one, isn't it? So we might use that 110. Keep it a little bit more on that blue. blue sort of tone. It's not too bad. A little bit just, I'm running a little bit of this up because it's a pinkier sort of background. And you can always put a bit of a background around your bunny if you want to. But because I'm not, I don't necessarily want the back of this bunny to be too harsh. But all I'm doing is just coming in with a glaze of that 110. And I'll give this a little soften. And the same with just coming out from here. Again, I just want to soften that whole little area in the background. Now this is where we can use our, that colour shaper tool, if you wanted to. I'm just sort of getting a few sort of hairs just coming up and over that darker area there at the top of the head as well. I don't want it to be too much of a dark line. I don't think there's that much more we need to do to that back area. I might just again with that 635 just feather it a little bit more into that pink. And then I'm just going to grab that Q-tip. And like I said, along that sort of little edge, I'm just going to soften that. Again, we can just sort of pull with that Q-tip, pull a little bit of that pigment just sort of up and into that back area, just to sort of fuzzy it up a little bit. It's my technical term. Back and forth along that edge. Or, like I said, if you do have one of those colour shapers, then that would be ideal for there as well. I'm just going to just slightly blend just where I pop that grey there as well, because I do want this to be very out of focus. And the same here, just run that just along the edge, just to soften the back of that bunny. And it does sort of come down a little bit behind that ear. Make sure we're getting that shape of that little section there right. All right. A little bit of soften. Before I come in and just get some of these little hairs all sort of puffed out round his face, I'm going to come in with a 270, because just on this little side here, again, we've got these little hair follicles and they're just a slightly warmer tone. I'm just going to ever so gently, and it's not something that will really sort of be overly picked up probably on the camera. You might be able to just sort of see it. But like I say, it just adds that bit of contrast. Same just around the edge here of the face. I'm just going to add the tiniest little bit of that. Softening that sort of little transition there before we pull those longer hairs out. Again, it just sort of softens everything. Feel it just needs a little darken down just underneath his head. Again, you can just come in. I mean, you could even go a little bit darker with that and use perhaps the 704. Tiniest little glaze. And just underneath there we can see it's a bit darker. You could always go with the 706. I wouldn't go much darker than that. But I think the 704, that warm grey 3 is working not too bad. Okay. Darker little section just up this side of the foot, coming out from that sort of browner area. It could always go a little tiny bit darker. See if I could even find my 706. Oh, here it is. Maybe just that tiny. In fact, I could probably go even darker. Let's do the 708. Just a little bit, little glaze. Just coming out in that shadow. Again, I don't want that to be too sort of harsh. Again, just a little dab, just softens it. It just changes that tone of that little section of fur. Again, if you've got a bit on your Q-tip and there's anywhere else you can see that you think it just needs that little bit of a darken, you can just pick up a little bit of that pigment and just drop it down. Then over here could probably be just a tiny little bit darker. Alright, so I'm going to come in, I'm going to use my General's chalk, I'm going to give that a sharpen. A sharp point. And we're just going to start bringing out just some of these little hairs. Now, like I said, don't worry if you don't have this pencil, you could use just a charcoal white or just continue just with your own white that you have. Again, just want to look at that reference. Just want to just soften, just pull out and just extend some of these hairs. Again, just be mindful of picking up that colour, but you still want to be giving that a little wipe. Again, any sort of little sections that just need to be a bit brighter. And like this here, I'm actually going to pull a few of these hairs through with that General's just to brighten up a little bit. Like I said, it is lovely and bright in this sort of centre section of his head. And just make sure you're also sort of pulling some of those hairs into those surrounding areas. You want that transition to be nice. And just lighten up a tiny bit just at the side of his eye again. Because like I said, it does happen, especially when you're working upright, dust tends to fall down over the areas you've been. That's why I always love to just at the very end of a portrait, just go over and actually, just brighten up any colours, any highlights. Very important here because we're coming into that dark section. You make sure that you're wiping off that pencil. And remember what I said, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have every little hair coming out in exactly the same spot. All we're doing here is just softening. Pull out a few hairs just coming out from that mouth. This isn't our little whiskers yet. This is just these longer sort of hairs just coming out over the top. And this one here, it's kind of hard to distinguish where the sort of bunny's sort of cheek and face sort of end and his little legs begin. And I'm going to add a few up here just to brighten up this sort of section. Nice and bright on this side. And just down on this little toe here, this little foot. A little bit brighter just on this little piece of hair coming out from the top. Just gone a little bit sort of over there. I've lost that sort of shape. I'm going to take my kneadable eraser, see if I can just create that little indent again. Dabbing in there just to lift some of that pigment. I'm just trying to get that shape a little bit more spot on. Again, just having a good look. Pull a few of those little hairs out from that chin area. A little bit lighter, maybe just in a few of these little hairs up here. Again, this is just sort of our little sort of final little tweaks. Just lighten up that little ear there. I think it needs to be a little bit brighter. Lighten up that little section underneath. Little touches here and there. Again, just on this ear. I've got a few just sort of little lighter hairs just on the tip of that ear. Thinking here could be a bit brighter. Again, we're looking at that tonal values. A longer little whisker or an eyelash just coming out here. I'm going to draw that one in. Now, when you're drawing whiskers or eyelashes and all that sort of thing, they can be quite scary and intimidating. But the trick is, nice sharp pencil, have a bit of a practice on a spare piece of paper if you need to. But even just before you start, just sort of figure out where your pencil's going to go. Because sometimes if you do that, that's enough just for that muscle memory, so that when you do put your pencil down, you sort of know where you want that pencil to go. I'm going to take my pencil, and as you as your whisker comes out, you lift the pencil off. Now you can't really, let's see if I can define that a little bit more so you can see it a little bit better. Now I've probably gone a little bit too thick. So what you can do to fix that is come in with the colour that's surrounding it. So in my case, I'm going to use the 708. And you just come in at the side of that whisker and just add a little bit of that pigment just up the edge. And it just narrows that. I don't know if you can see it. It's a very faint little whisker. But you can see that it just, it changes the shape. And worst case scenario, if you didn't get it right, you can just come in and, blend it in, add a little bit of that surrounding colour, and then try it again. Don't let the fear of whiskers sort of hold you back, because they still terrify me. You could spend 15 hours working on a drawing, if not longer, and then you've got to come in and put whiskers in, and yeah, it can be very, very intimidating. I'm just adjusting a little bit of shape here. I'm probably just getting to that sort of that tweaking sort of stage, and you've got to be careful because you can just keep going and keep going, and I am a bit notorious for that, I am afraid. Just sort of softening the fur just around the feet. Again, I'm trying to be mindful not to put in detail where it doesn't belong. White needs to come into there. Just getting these just a little, tiny little dab with my finger. Again, just making sure that we've brought all the little hairs across that we want to. The top here doesn't look too bad. Again, just mindful of that sort of little fuzziness coming out from the top there. Tiny little bit of pastel dust pushed down into the paper there. And just out into this sort of part of the face. Nice and soft. Alright, now we've got some of these bigger sort of whiskers coming down the front. Again, nice sharp pencil. Just going to start bringing, again, have a look at your drawing, see where they are, and just start pulling these sort of little whiskers round. Don't stress, like I said, we're not trying to get every little whisker in there. Now don't worry about these little dots. I'm going to come in and just fix those up in a second. Can't really see the ones as well on this side of the face. Little ones just coming out from there. Now I'm going to take I'm going to use my colour shaper, but if you've got just your Q-tip, it'll do just the same. In fact, no, I'll use my cotton bud because that's probably what most people have got. And all you do is you just dab the end of that little whisker, and you just sort of blend it in to where it's come out of, and you can see it just gets rid of that little grainy dot. Again, if you've just maybe think you've gone a little bit too thick, like I think this little one here, you can just run your Q-tip and just sort of soften round about. I don't think that one there looks. I'm just going to get rid of this one, and to do that I'm just blending. I'm going to come back in with that white and just pull that little chin, the hairs back out. Be a little bit fainter with some of those little hairs. Same on this side. I'm going to make sure I haven't lost any of those. A few little whiskers just in this little section here. We've got a little one here just coming out into the ear area a little bit. And make sure I've got this little section up here right. I might just add the tiniest little dabs of that white just to brighten that up just a little bit, just on the side of the face there. Now I'm going to come in with my Cretacolor black. You can just use your normal black or your charcoal. All I'm doing is just reinforcing that pupil. Like I said, it is quite often that the dust that you create will fall down onto your pupil. And what happens is it just sort of dulls it a little bit. But you always just want to make sure at the end, you just come in, have a look at your blackest areas, and just redefine some of these shapes. I think that little nostril Paper that's just gone, just a tiny little bit skew-iffy. I'm just going to come in with that ivory. And be careful here, because like I said, it is going to pick up that pigment. I want to just make that more into a point. And I think just that little shape here just needs a little tiny adjustment. Again, this is just me being a bit picky with my one. Again, we can just, I don't want to come too dark on this side of that little nose. I might just use just the normal black here. Again, just making sure that we're just defining that little line on the side of the nose. A couple of tiny little hairs is coming out. Again, don't get hung up on that detail. Alright, I'm just going to clean up the edges at the top here. I'm going just I know I'm trying to get this a bit sort of fuzzy, but I might have just come a little bit too far out. Either that, or I'm just going to soften more along that edge, make it look a little bit more sort of uniformed all the way around. That's a little bit better. It creates that little soft sort of glow. Okay, final touches now. I think a few of these darker little hairs need to come out a little bit onto the face. I'm going to try that with my colour shaper. Just sort of flicking ever so gently. Again, if you don't have one of these, you can just use your, use a Q-tip. Going to have to, I think, darken down just ever so slightly in here. Now, this is probably a good little learning sort of moment. When you put your highlights on the top, your lightest layers, if they're not showing through, then that is a really good indication that your base color isn't dark enough. Now, it's a little bit tricky with this one because, our little bunny is quite bright anyway. What I would probably do here, and I'm probably going to use, I might just try a little bit more just of that 270, that warm grey. I don't think it's going to make much difference, because I'm really not seeing much of these little whiskers. I could try and add a few more. Just adding maybe just a little bit more pressure. That's a little bit better. You're starting to see them there. So really, that is your options when it comes to, if things aren't sort of standing out that well. I mean, even then, it is a little bit trickier to see, especially on the camera. And it is a bit harder sometimes, especially when I've got these lights on above me in the studio. And I'm always sort of conscious about what you guys can sort of see as opposed to, you know, what I'm seeing actually in front of me isn't necessarily always exactly the same. And that's another thing that I just want to point out too. Never get yourself really sort of hung up on the colours, or, you know, a lot of people will say, I can never get my whites as bright as you, or get the whiskers that white. But just remember, I am under glaring lights here. So what you're seeing on your end, and I mean, you've got to take into consideration as well what you're watching, you know, the tutorial on. Are you watching it on your phone? Are you watching it on an older iPad? You know, it's all of these things do make a difference. So please never sort of think, oh my God, I'm not seeing what, you know, mine isn't looking identical. You don't want it to look identical. You want this to be your drawing, and it needs to be, you know, uniquely yours. I'm just sort of here to just give you a few sort of tips, a few sort of pointers, you know, something that will give you a reasonably nice drawing at the end of it. And you know, and the rest is practice. It's finding what techniques you like to use. You know, never think that you need to be identical to the person, you know, that you're following. Because like I said, there's so many other factors that come into play. I'm probably only going to just again, just me being a little bit sort of pedantic, I'm just going to dot that 642 just underneath that mouth a little bit, and so that it just stands out just a tiny little bit more. Again, like I said, you could spend hours and hours and hours just tweaking. So sometimes you've just got to say to yourself, put the pencil down and back off from the paper. I'm just going to, like I say, I'm just going to have one last little look. I think this little tuft of hair could probably come out a little bit further. Yeah, there's just a few sort of lighter ones in the background. But it comes back to that whole thing. If no one's seeing your reference image next to your drawing, they're not going to know whether that little piece of fur was coming across there or not. Alright, what I think I might do now, I'm going to soften this edge here. Probably just use the Q-tip for that, I think. Again, I'm just flicking out, just coming down the side of the body. Not too much. So just gives that just a little soften. Same just on this side. Just softening that edges. Not so much so in the actual boot itself. It doesn't actually look as if it's coming out too much. I think just a little dab on the edge might be sufficient for that. But what I do want to do is put in a little bit of a shadow. I don't want, you won't need to do that if you're doing the background, then just, you know, you do the background, you know, as you see fit. But for this sort of area here, I am just going to darken down just a little bit at the bottom, just so that our little bunny doesn't look like he's floating in midair. Now I might, don't want to be coming in too dark, I might use the 625, the burnt umber. And again, we just want to have a look at where the bunny is sort of sitting. There is a bit of a shadow there anyway. So just with the side of the pencil, and I'm holding it fairly far back because I want this to be quite light. You just want to just apply a bit of that pigment. Doesn't need to be much. Just on the paper. And then you can just come in just gently, just around your bunny. I'm just going to move my position here a little bit. Again, just underneath his feet. You're not trying to get this to be, you know, just a solid block. All I want to do here is just, like I say, we're just adding in a bit of that tone, just to give the impression of that being a little bit of the ground that he's standing on. And you still want to be seeing some of your paper coming through as well. We can always darken down a little bit if we want to too, so we can always try a bit of the, maybe a bit of the 610, that raw umber. And we can come in over where it's a little bit darker on the side. A bit darker just underneath, just right up close to his body, because obviously that's the sort of section that is most in shadow. A little bit round this side. Again, just be careful not to sort of come in and draw over the top of your bunny. Going to define the end of that foot a little bit there. I need to add a little bit more of that 182. Just a tiny little bit. Again, just trying to get the bottom of that foot a little bit better. Now, in these little sections here are really dark. So I'm going to come in with the black. It's the Carbothello. I want to get this little shadow in here. Quite dark, just coming in the center here as well. And also just round the base of this foot. Out. Then just in here, we can always just glaze a little bit of that black, just coming up. And a little bit of the black just into that back shadow. And then we can always just grab our Q-tip. Just give that just a little soften. I like the graininess when I do these sort of little sort of shadows, just so that, like I said, just so your subject's not sort of floating in midair. Because sometimes when you do things, that's exactly what it looks like. If you haven't got a background in, it just looks like their little feet are just up in midair, and that can look a little bit silly. So I often will do just exactly what I've done here. But I always want to see the grain coming through. I like to see just a bit, you know, that paper. I'm not trying to, like if I was doing a landscape or something like that, then yes, you know, you'd be blending properly. But for this sort of, just sort of style and technique, you don't need to. I think because I've come to the end of the page there, I'm actually going to do the same here. I'm just going to just bring, doesn't have to go all the way, but I just want it to fill up a little bit more of that paper. Might even just come down a little bit. Again, this is completely your choice, your preference as to how you want the area around your bunny to look. If you're happy just with the bunny, then brilliant. I'm just going to come in here, make sure that this little darker area here, again, is just sort of soft. The tiniest again, just a little bit of black, again, just to sort of tie it in with that, other side. I'm just going to soften these little black areas here. Again, don't want them to be looking grainy or harsh. Again, if you've got a bit of that pigment on your Q-tip, feel free to just sort of add it where you think it might need to go. All right, I think I've probably gone, I think, as far as I can with this one. Like I said, I think this little nose area here could be a little bit brighter. Again, I'm just, like I said, I should have probably added in a little bit of the yellow ochre in hindsight. Lighten up that nose a little bit. But look, if you have got, that yellow sort of ochre pencil, then please use it in your drawing, because I think that will make a little bit of difference to this here. It's looking a lot closer to the reference photo in the studio, but because that lights are flashing on it, it's just looking a little bit washed out, which is annoying me. But that's okay. I've just got to, like I said, put my positive pants on. And probably the only other thing, and this is difficult to do because this is such an out of focus subject, basically all the way around except for the center little part. It is really, for me anyway, is a little bit tricky for your eye, just to sort of, because you just think, that's unfinished. I've finished the drawing and I've missed out this whole back area. So I think just for me, and if it doesn't bother you, that's fine. But for me, I'm just going to come in with a 635. And I'm just going to add the tiniest little bit of texture. Because it is, like I said, it's really, my eye is looking at it. And although I know that it's out of focus, I think it's over blended. And again, that's just something to be aware of. Blending your pastels is, it is part of the process. But I think you can over blend. And although I was trying sort of desperately to get that sort of real, sort of blurry, out of focus look, I think I've just taken the blending just a step too far. So even that I'm happier with. Just by taking that bistre and just creating a little bit of texture. Same just over into here. Might use a little bit of that grey, that's 708, the warm grey 5. And I'm just going to kind of do the same sort of thing. Pulling in just a little bit into that area. And then I think this little bit here just needs a little bit of a brighten, just at the back. I'm just coming in with the white. And then that way I can get that little bit of the foreground a little bit brighter before it goes into that back area. A little bit just there, final little touch. I mean, like I say, you can spend hours and hours just tweaking and just making little adjustments. And I think there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. You know, if I'm sort of working on a piece and I've got music going in the background and I'm just all relaxed, and you just get lost in yourself. And it's a wonderful therapeutic process. But I think for a tutorial, I need to learn just when to put my pencils down. I'd love to spend another, potentially another hour on this, just sort of, putting in tiny little details. But you've also got to realise too that if you take a little step back, and this is something I recommend all the time in my tutorials, is just lean back in your chair, stand up, go have a coffee, come back, and then look at your drawing, and usually things will just jump right out at you. You don't see them when you're sitting staring at your drawing, but you do see them when you come back and you have a look and you go, yeah, no, that doesn't look quite right. And that's your opportunity to just, have a little adjustment, have a little tweak if you can, fix things up. But overall, I'm not unhappy with that one. I hope it has been of some help to you, and it's just sort of giving you an idea of, I know I've went a little bit over time on this one. I was hoping, I always think things are going to take less than they do. So this one probably all up has probably been around, what, the 4-hour mark maybe? But, it's an afternoon of drawing, and the result hopefully will be that you'll have your own little portrait of a bunny. Yeah, and you can be proud of that. Be proud of your achievements. Be proud of giving it a go, because you never know what you can do until you actually give it a try. So all we need to do now, and I like to do this at the end of all of my tutorials, is just pop my initials. I'm just going to pop them just down here at the bottom of his little feet. Pop your initials on your drawing. That's your baby bunny drawing. I'd love to see you share your finished drawings over on our Facebook group community. I really would love to see them. I hope you've enjoyed it, and yeah, I'll catch you in our next live draw along.